The topic for today is partial functions. Have we talked about partial functions before? Either yes or no answer should be there. Do you remember? No. Okay, good. Then this is the first time. Let's look at the definition. You might have thought of them intrinsically. I'm sure I have talked about one or two partial functions in between.
Partial parities?
No, partial parities are not partial functions. They are total functions. Let's talk about what partial functions are, right? This is my definition of Boolean function, correct? If you want to be adventurous, or even if you just want things to be different, then I can always talk about -1 comma, right? In all these cases, the function remains Boolean. I can take range to be 0, 1, all that is small modifications is fine. But ultimately, my Boolean function is a function from hypercube to a Boolean. And when I talk about this, for every function, there are two important things: domain and range. For a Boolean function, the domain is the Boolean hypercube. And my range is a Boolean variable. It could be 0, 1, it could be -1 comma 1, it could be true, false, there could be many other things, but generally we take it to be 0, 1 or -1. Everyone is familiar, I assume, with what is a domain, what is a range. Domain is the input, and range is the domain is the possible inputs, and range is the set of possible outputs. In many cases, and this should not seem surprising to you, we don't need to specify the function on the entire domain. This takes us to the definition of partial Boolean function. Notice that the function is not specified on the entire Boolean hypercube. It is only specified on a subset of 0, 1 to the power n. What does this mean? I think the picture explains it quite clearly. In the case of total functions, this rectangle depicts the entire, how should I say, entire domain, right, or entire Boolean hypercube. I'm representing Boolean hypercube by a rectangle. In case of total function, the entire Boolean hypercube can be divided into two parts. Again, I'm not saying that the two elements here are close by Hamming distance or something. No. Just think of them as sets at this point of time. I can divide my inputs into two parts. Inputs which are giving me function value 0, inputs which are giving me function value 1. This is called a total function because my domain is the total Boolean hypercube. On the contrary, we are interested many a times in this kind of a representation, which we call partial functions. In this set, I have three partitions. One is the set of inputs on which I want my answer to be 0. There is another set of inputs on which I want my answer to be 1. On the other elements, I don't care. There are three parts. On what you answer on non-domain, I don't care, right? So this gives rise to three parts. And I can say in terms of D, what is this portion? Don't care portion. How will you write it mathematically?
Complement of D in 0, 1.
Very nice. Right? This is the part which I don't care. Right? Definition is very, very simple, and this should tell you that partial parities are not partial functions. Right? Because partial parity is specified on the entire Boolean. If I talk about chi-sx to be x1, x2, it is a function, or I should say chi-s is a function from n to -1. It depends on two variables. That's immaterial. But I can think of it as a function where value is specified for every element of the Boolean hyperparameter. That's why this is not a partial. Let's take some examples of, so before we take example, let me tell you one reason why they are very, very important. Partial functions are analogs of promise problems in complexity. What are promise problems? Whenever someone says, oh, your input is going to be something special, it is promised to be from a subset instead of the entire domain. Mostly in complexity, we are talking about languages which are subset of 0, 1 star. In this case, if the element is inside the language, we say, oh, the answer is 1. If it is outside L, we say 0. But sometimes we are just interested in problems where for some values, my answer is in the language. For some values, some inputs, my answer is not in the language. And there are a host of other inputs for which I do. So in that case, these are called promise problems. I will give you an example very soon, don't worry. But these promise problems are very, very natural in approximation theory and complexity. When you want to say that how well can I approximate a problem, and you will get into promise problems, gap problems, promise problems, partial functions. All of them are similar in spirit. Idea is you don't care about the answer on certain things. There's a nice survey by Goldreich, actually, which talks about these promise problems and gives you a lot of applications of why promise problems are important in complexity. And the point again is that in some sense, total functions are special, not promise problems. The most natural way to define a function is to define it as a partial function. And then we can study total functions. Let's see some examples of partial functions. We have actually talked about them already. First one is called promise OR. This is a partial function which is defined on how many inputs? By looking at the definition, can you tell me how many inputs is it defined on?
N plus 1.
Very nice. There is one input of Hamming weight 0 and there are n inputs of Hamming weight 1. So the number of inputs are n plus 1. Correct? Instead of to the power n. And if you had paid attention to the way we proved the lower bounds, you can actually see that even the simpler problem of promise OR, the deterministic complexity of promise OR is also n. Because if you remember, we only cared about when we dealt with the adversary only used the inputs which had either Hamming weight 1 or 0. And similarly, even this is true for randomized complexity. I don't have to take the general problem OR, even for the simple problem of promise OR, obviously seems simpler than the entire OR problem where we only care about Hamming weight of X is 0 or 1. Even for that problem, any randomized query complexity algorithm is going to take omega n queries. Because, can you think of why? Why is it still hold for promise OR that R of 1 by 3 is omega n?
Because we had cared about the worst case scenario when we were deriving that for our epsilon, and there the Hamming weight was 1.
Right,
Or
the
0.
hard distribution which we talked about, right? Remember what was the hard distribution? We gave probability close to 1 by 3 on all 0 inputs, and all the 1 inputs, we kind of shared them with uniform probability. So we only had our hard distribution from Hamming weight X is 0 or. So we can take the same hard distribution and it will show that the randomized query complexity is also, randomized query complexity of promise OR is also. And this intuition is very helpful, that most of the hardness of OR many times when we prove the hardness of ore, we only care about the fact that the function value differs at 0 and 1. This actually translates into many different lower bounds for different functions. And we will give an example of that when we talk about sensitivity, block sensitivity, etc. Okay, but this is a very, very important realization that as soon as I start talking about partial functions, many of my lower bounds hold true for much simpler, okay, much simpler in quotes probably, much simpler, arguably much simpler partial functions. This is an example of partial promise OR. Another important function is gap majority. What is gap majority? It is just defined on the Boolean hypercube just at two levels. Like promise OR was at Hamming weight is 0 or 1. This is defined when Hamming weight is either n by 2 plus root n or n by 2 minus 2. If the Hamming weight is n by 2 plus root n, then you should answer plus 1 or I should say minus 1. And when the Hamming weight is n by 2 minus root n, then you should answer plus 1. And this is called the gap majority problem. You might think, what is the use of it? So let me tell you what is the use of it. And this, again, I'm going to prove the use. This is proved last year. It was one of the best papers of the best critical science conference. Let me just tell you what the result showed. The result was able to show, you remember we talked about this thing, composition for randomized query complexity. We know it for deterministic. What did I say about randomized?
It was an open problem.
Yes, it was an open problem, right? Now, in a recent paper, it has been shown that if you can show that this composes, this implies R composes for any inner function, for outer function F. That means you pick any inner function, I don't care. If my F composes with gap majority, it will compose with every inner function G. In other words, when you talk about composition, you only have to care about the case when your inner function is gap majority. Again, don't worry about how you prove it. It's a big proof, and this is one of the major results. But you understand the importance that instead of considering a general G, I can just talk about gap majority as inner function, and it will tell me whether the function F will compose or not.
So are there function f's for which this above condition has been shown to be true?
Yes. If
Okay.
you take, for example, AND and OR, then this is true. And by that matter, actually, if you take any symmetric function, this condition is true.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, and obviously it seems simpler when you only have one inner function to care about, right? Then the problem seems much easier.
So any symmetric function composed with some other Boolean function, R will compose over this.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So,
Mhm.
so if F composes with it does not composes with gap majority, then we cannot say anything about F compose with any other function.
Correct.
It may,
but we know at least one G for which it will not compose.
yeah, that is the gap
The gap
majority.
majority, yes.
Yeah. Only if it composes, then we are sure that for all other that it will compose.
Right. But if it
Okay.
does not compose with gap majority, then for a particular G we don't.
Yes.
But composition in general will definitely not hold true, because obviously we have a counter example, right?
Okay.
Composition in general for the F will not. Great. This was the so what I'm trying to show you is that we have already seen many examples where partial functions are very, very useful. And if you think about it, as I said, as Goldrake mentioned, that there are many, many examples where partial functions are obvious or promise problems are obvious. For example, if you want to solve some problem like, given a planar graph, there cannot be more than n by 2 triangles. Given a connected graph, the number of triangles should be at least this much, or things like that. All those statements are, remember, like that. Given a planar graph, given a connected graph, that means you are given a
special kind of input.
promise on there, right? Or a special kind of, and that
Yeah.
makes them automatically partial functions. Right? You remember how we defined graph properties as Boolean functions, remember, right? We said that the edges, there are n choose 2 edges, each of those could take value 1 or 0. And depending on that, we will get a graph. Right? So when we say planar graph, that's some subset of 0, 1 to n choose 2. What subset? It's hard to quantify, but it is the set of all. You take these strings, the corresponding graph, if it is planar, then we will say yes, it is part of the domain, otherwise it is not. But my point is, in all these cases, you will be dealing with partial functions. Right? So this is again, I have to introduce a new quantity, but ultimately what I wanted to say was that the composition question for R epsilon basically depends on whether it composes with gap majority or not. Okay. Why are we talking about partial? They seem like total functions, just the domain is limited. We have looked at these functions for so long. Why? What is special? The special point is, today we are going to see that partial functions are very important and useful. And actually, I have tried to convince you that there are clear examples where you have to take partial functions, and considering partial functions makes our understanding much better. Those I have already shown you. But partial functions are different than total functions. That means the same arguments, when you apply for partial functions, you need to be careful. You might tend to make mistakes. So for the rest of the lecture, we will take cases where some theorems, some properties will be true for total functions, but for partial functions, they will not. And we have to make sure, whenever we make an argument, whenever we give a proof of a theorem, remember it is many a times when your argument obviously works for total function, it might not work for partial. And these are important things to consider. Many of the results you will see, they will say, oh, this works for total functions, partial functions we don't. Sometimes they will give counter example. For partial functions it doesn't work, but for total functions it will. And all such cases are possible. The point is, when partial functions are involved, be careful. Let's look at some examples which kind of convinces you that partial functions can be different. And what will be our favorite topic? Approximating. This is what we have learned yesterday. Let's focus on that. Let's talk about approximating. What is the approximate degree of promise on? Right? You remember that for deterministic query complexity, for randomized query complexity, changing OR to promise OR did not change. Right? It remained n. What do you think approximate degree of promise OR? Let's go one by one. Anindya, what is your guess? Don't worry, you don't have to be right.
Sir, Anindya is not.
Oh, I thought he had joined. Sorry. Okay. Then Debarshu.
It was already root n. I
So
think
definitely it cannot be more than root n, right? Because promisor is
yes, it's
simpler than
yeah.
or, right?
So constant.
Okay. Aditya.
Login.
Okay. Udit.
Constant maybe.
Okay. Vatsal.
Constant.
Constant. Nobody is for root n. Okay. So this was a trick question because I will show that the question is not well defined. And I will tell you two ways to define this question. And you will see that in one way, it will become constant. In another way, it will remain. But the important part is this question is not well defined. Nobody thought of that, right?
I thought of one way of defining it, like the lowest degree polynomial, which satisfies that condition for all inputs in D.
Okay, okay, very good, right? But you see that there is an ambiguity here, right?
So what else? How else would it be defined then?
Okay, let's talk about this, right? So why is there an ambiguity and why it has to be an ambiguity, right? Now for total f, we defined approximate degree like this, right? That fx minus px should be less than 1 by 3 for all x element of 0, 1 to the power n. And then approximate degree was the minimum over the best polynomial, the degree of. This is what we remember. I don't have to emphasize it again. This is something which you said you remember now, right? And for partial function, one obvious condition would be that mod of fx minus px is less than equal to 1 by 3 for all x element of domain. Agreed? This is the condition which has to be there, which is clearly an analog of the approximate degree defined in the total. The question is, what about x element x which are not in? What happens to them? And why is that an interesting question? As one of you already said, I thought that it should only be defined for x element of it. Now, one way to say it is, remember the diagram for partial functions? We said that the rectangle is divided into three parts, fx equal to 0, fx equal to 1, and don't care. If the input was don't care, then why should I care what the value of polynomial is over that? But on the other hand, I can also say that I'm only talking about Boolean functions. I'm in the case of Boolean functions. Or for example, if you remember the quantum algorithm, you don't remember the quantum algorithm, but remember the point about the quantum algorithm, that the probability of acceptance was a polynomial. And that means whatever polynomial comes out of a quantum algorithm, the polynomial will always be bounded between 0 and 1. And it also makes sense that, since I'm only talking about Boolean functions, then I don't care what the value is, but it should be either -1 or 1. That means it should be bounded between, or the value should be 0 or 1. That means it should be bounded between -1 by 3 and 4. That means there are two options of defining what happens on x, which is not in the domain. One is don't care. This is called the unbounded approximate. Because in this case, on non-domain points, my polynomial could go anywhere. It could have any possible value. This is the one which one of you already had in mind. And I think I have convinced you that in many cases, it is better to consider the bounded version, where we say that on the domain inputs, definitely the value should be close to the function, but on the non-domain values, it could be anything but bounded. It should be inside the particular bound. It should look like a Boolean function. It need not be a specific Boolean function, but it should resemble a Boolean function. Now you can here ask that, oh, it is between -1/3 and 1/3, or between 2/3 and 4/3, or you can say that the simpler condition to put is that my value is bounded between -1/3 and 4. The value should be bounded. What it will be, I don't know. Do you
So the bounded one becomes useful or important when we use this value of px further in some other process, let's say.
Exactly. So we can, at this point, approximate degree can be defined in either ways. Depending on our use, we will either use the unbounded version or the bounded, right? But if the definition is clear, what is the relation between the left-hand side and right-hand side, the unbounded approximate degree and bounded approximate degree?
Less than equal to.
Correct.
Unbounded is lesser.
Unbounded is less than equal to bounded, because in bounded I have to satisfy more constraints, right? So if any polynomial is a bounded approximation, it is clearly an unbounded approximation. So whatever small degree I can achieve with bounded, I can definitely achieve with unbounded, but probably better. So there is a less than equal. And that means if we want to use our approximate degree to lower bound, that means it might be better to use this if it is a lower bound. And in the case of quantum query complexity, this is going to be a lower bound. We can even change this to 0 and 1. Since our P is going to capture the probability of acceptance, it has to be between 0 and 1. Right? So our function, the polynomial which is coming out of quantum query algorithm is very, very special. And hence, this bounded degree is still going to be a lower bound. And that's why for partial functions, we should use this as the lower bounding technique. It makes sense to use this. This is a stronger way to lower bound approximate. Questions about this? Why is bounded important? Why is unbounded important?
Why did you say bounded was more important? Just because of its use in quantum query complexity?
I have given you an example of quantum query complexity, but any domain where you want to make sure that the function value at the don't care points is some function value. We don't care whether it is -1 or 1, but it should be some function value. Then this approximation is better approximation.
Yeah.
And yeah, in quantum query complexity, obviously this is a better way because it's a bigger. Though if for all functions these two things were equal, then we wouldn't care. That would be a nice thing, right? We don't have to worry about these two things. But you can kind of get a hint, right, that is not going to happen. So what do you think will happen for promise OR? Remember we talked about promise OR and I said that depending on the way you define it, the value can change. So
strict inequality should be.
yes, strict inequality, but specifically the value of unbounded degree would be
Constant.
And
This
omega.
should be O.
So for promise OR, I think all of you can easily prove that the unbounded degree is 1. How? Can you give me a degree 1 approximating polynomial which approximates promise OR? I just want to be correct on Hamming weight 0 or Hamming weight 1.
x1 plus x2 plus up to xn.
Exactly. Actually, this does not give any error at all. This is like approximate degree unbounded, even with zero error, is just order of 1. It is actually 1. You not leave alone order of, it is exactly 1.
So in a way, the left definition becomes kind of trivial in many cases. So we are
In
interested
some
in.
cases. Yes. Yes. Very nice point, right? So in some cases, the unbounded case just becomes trivial, and approximation is too easy when we say unbounded.
Hmm.
Right? What is the degree of promise? Or we have seen that this is O1, or actually Y over, this is just 1. What about the bounded case? Do you just remember what I said on the last slide?
Is omega root n, but the proof.
Why? Yeah, what is the proof?
The proof should be same because the curve that we get that at 0 Hamming weight it is 0, and then as the Hamming weight increases, it is 1 at when the Hamming weight is 1, and then for all the points after that it is between. It is bounded in a band, so the proof would be same.
Exactly, very good point. Yes, the proof remains exactly the same as what we saw last time. Because if you remember, what did we use last time? There were only 2 things we used about the polynomial. First, that it should stay between a narrow band, which is going to be true for promise OR. And second thing, there should be a sharp derivative. And the sharp derivative will come from the gap between 0 and 1, because the fact that the function value changes between 0 and 1. And then if you take any function which satisfies these conditions, it should have quite approximate degree at least omega. By the way, the same argument also shows that for any symmetric function which is non-trivial, that means it is not constant 0 or not constant 1, approximate degree is at least omega. Do you see that the same proof goes through? That
For any non-constant symmetric
for any
polynomial.
non-constant, yes.
Yeah.
Because I just
Okay.
need a function value change just at one point.
Yeah.
If there is a point where function value is changing, function approximate degree of f is more than omega. And if you study the literature, you will see that it need not exactly be root n. If this change happens between 0 and 1, then it is root n. As this change comes closer and closer to the center, your approximate degree keeps rising. Specifically, for majority, the approximate degree is order of n, not root n. But anyway, that's a different proof. We understand the approximate degree of symmetric functions. When I say approximate degree, again,
So
I'm
when
talking
you
about the
said
total symmetric function.
when you said the majority approximate degree of majority is On, it
Hmm.
cannot be shown using this argument.
No,
What we did for this.
no. The
Okay.
argument part of, we will make a univariate polynomial, and for that univariate polynomial, we can't use directly LH and Zeller because that will only give a bound of. We will use some
Yeah,
other
that will-
approximation theory theorems, and that will give us order. But the idea will remain similar. You convert the approximate polynomial into a symmetric polynomial, then to a univariate polynomial. And knowing the behavior of univariate polynomial, you want to bound it. And notice that I'm talking about total symmetric functions. For them, it doesn't matter whether I take the unbounded or the bounded. But yeah, so I think
So
Mhm.
yeah, like as the inflection point or the point where the function value is one moves towards right from 1 to n by 2, the sharp derivative, the magnitude of sharp derivative decreases. So in a way, it seems
No.
like
no, it doesn't. See, the derivative value, it comes from, as Adit pointed out, Lagrange's theorem, right? Which is basically saying that in distance of 1, the value changes by at least 1 by 3.
yeah, now at a distance of n by 2, the
No,
same value change.
No. Function value changes close to n by 2. That means at n by 2 minus 1, it will be
Okay,
0,
okay.
and n by
Yeah.
2, it will be 1.
Okay. Yeah.
See, at every integer, it has to be either 0 or 1, correct?
0 or 1. Yes.
So I'm talking about the closest place to n by 2 where the change is happening. If at n by 2 the change is happening, then the approximate degree turns out to be n. If the first change happens away from n by 2, then your approximate degree is small. And when it is the farthest away, like or, right, at that time the change is happening as much far from n by 2 as possible. The approximate degree is. But anyway, that is Paturi's result. That's a different topic. What I wanted to emphasize was that for approximate degree, there can be two possibilities: unbounded, bounded. Generally, when we think about the question, we didn't even think, or some of us did not even see that there might be two different definitions. And now we see there are two different definitions, and they will give different answers. Right? So this shows that partial functions are, once more, special. This is what.
Sir, the bounded case that you talked of.
Hmm.
Yeah, so over here, we are essentially dropping that special, the special case of or, because the special inputs, because that's what we are doing, right? In the case of promise or, we were taking Hamming weight 0 and Hamming weight 1 inputs. But as soon as we start talking about the bounded case, we no longer talk about those special inputs because of this the p of x lying between -1/3 to 4/3.
Right. So probably a nice diagram for promise or would be that my value goes like this. Even such approximating polynomials are allowed for promise. Is that what you are saying?
No, what I'm saying is when we are talking about this p of x over there lying between -1/3 to 4/3, and then we talk about the minimum of all such polynomials that we have. But isn't that same as removing that special inputs that we were talking about and just taking over all the taking f over all the inputs, over the entire hypercube?
No, because px minus fx less than 1/3 is more special, right? If I, are you saying that if I remove the first condition in bounded case?
Because this bound of -1/3 and 4/3 we are getting because we are taking f to be a Boolean function.
Correct.
And then that
No, so are you planning to define degree prime where you just have this condition? Is that what you want to say? Is that what you are saying?
No, actually I'm saying that in that case we don't need to take this x an element of d and x an element of d complement to be different.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yes. I have just written it like this, but you can just say for all x. Yes, it's the same thing. That I agree. Yes. This is what you are saying, right? In the second condition, I can have for all x instead of x outside the door.
Yes.
Yeah, that is correct. That it just follows because f is a Boolean, right? So that condition is automatic. Yes, thank you. I can talk about, I can simplify it and I say that my p is between -1/3 and 4/3 for all x, irrespective of whether it is in domain or not. But that doesn't change the bounded degree condition. it remains the same. Okay, should we move forward? Confusions? If there are no confusion, then I will return to randomized query complexity. Okay, we have seen one example where switching from total to partial functions changes the behavior. In approximate degree, we saw that now we have to be more careful. Let me show you an example where some theorem is true for total functions, but as soon as I change it to partial functions, the statement does not remain true. Okay, let's talk about R epsilon F, the randomized query complexity. Again, it's up to you. If you prefer, you can take it to be 1 by 3. Let's talk about R 1 by 3F. That is, but you know it doesn't matter if you have a constant less than half, you are happy. Right? What happens to this query complexity, randomized query complexity, if my function is symmetric? There are obviously two outliers when your function is constant. In that case, the randomized query complexity is
0.
0. Correct? Everyone sees that? Right? Quite clear. So let's talk about only non-trivial is another word for non-constant. Suppose I have a non-constant symmetric function. What is its randomized query complexity? Do you want to take a guess? This is going to be omega. Not just for OR, but if your function is symmetric, then the randomized query complexity is always omega.
Sir, I think you mentioned sometime earlier that not here, not in this lecture, but many lectures ago, that d of f for symmetric functions is conjectured to be big O of n, I think.
Oh, the degree of f. You don't mean d of f. You mean d of f or degree of f? See, d of f is actually n.
Okay.
Okay, because you can always answer so that by n minus 1, you have exactly t minus 1 inputs as 1. Like, suppose the function value is different between t minus 1 and t. You can always answer so that you have t minus 1. Let's say you first answer with 1 up to t minus 1 values, then keep answering 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, right?
Yeah.
And then depending on the last value,
Yeah.
your function.
Got it.
So df is always equal to n. Degree of f, I'm not saying order of n. I say that it is very, very close to n. It is n minus order of n to the 0.535. Sorry, 525. So it is much bigger than n by 2. It is much bigger than 99 n by 1000. It is much bigger than that, right?
Yeah.
So that's a different here. What we want to show is that the randomized query complexity is also omega n. We showed it for OR. The time now is to show it for symmetric, non-constant symmetric. And if the function is non-constant symmetric, then we know that there exists some value t such that the function value changes between Hamming distance t minus 1 and Hamming distance t. Right? And without loss of generality, I can assume that fx is equal to 1 when cardinality of x is t, and fx is equal to 0 when cardinality of x is t minus 1. Why can I assume that?
Because we can consider either f or f complement.
Exactly. Right. So if uh, my t appears after n by 2, then in the inputs I change 1 to 0 and 0 to 1. And definitely in the algorithms, I can always, whenever I get a 0, I will think of it as 1. So so there are two ways to complement the function. One is a very natural complement, f to 1 minus f. Correct? That is giving me that fx is equal to 1 at the higher Hamming weight and 0 at the lower. That is
And the
one
other
way
is
of
to complement the inputs.
right, and that will tell us for t less than n by 2. Correct? So these two conditions I can assume. Now I have a t where function value switches like this. For x equal to t minus 1, it is 0, at t is equal to 1. And you want to prove that r epsilon f is omega m. How will we prove it? How do we
Use
give lower?
Gauss minimax.
hard distribution.
Hard
Yes.
in
Yes, all of you are correct. Using Yau's minimax, or in other words, by constructing a hard distribution. Now, looking at how we constructed the hard distribution for OR, and also the fact that I'm just emphasizing this property, what is your guess for the hard distribution?
a uniform distribution on these two, I mean all the x such that modulus of x is t and Hamming weight of x is t minus 1.
Yeah, so there are now, when you say uniform distribution, it is slightly, there are multiple ways to define it. Let me just say that with probability half, my Hamming weight would be t. That means for any x for which Hamming weight is t, I will pick it with this one. Similarly, with half the weight, I will pick a Hamming weight of t minus 1. That means if my x is of weight t minus 1, then its probability, the probability weight assigned to it is 1 by 2 times n choose t minus 1. So you have one weight of probability, you divide it into half and half. First half is equally divided between all Hamming weights, all inputs of Hamming weight t. Other half is equally divided between inputs of Hamming weight t minus 1. Is the Hamming weight, is the hard distribution clear for this function? Can we move forward?
Yes.
Okay. Everyone is fine, right? Remember our objective. We have a function where Hamming value changes, function value changes between Hamming weight t minus 1 and Hamming weight t. We want to show that any randomized algorithm should make omega n correct. And for that, we are using Yau's min-max. We are putting this hard distribution. Now, we want to say, what do we want to say? Suppose you have a deterministic tree whose depth is some constant, let's say n by 100 or so. Then this decision tree, a fixed deterministic tree of depth at most n by 100, cannot compute f with a constant probability according to the distribution, or in other words, on a constant fraction of inputs according to mu, the function will give wrong value. If I show this, then I am done.
Could you repeat this statement, last statement?
What I want to show, so remember what was Yau's min-max? Yau's min-max said that the distributional complexity is less than the randomized query complexity. To show that means to show a lower bound, we wanted to come up with a distribution mu such that for any deterministic tree D, this condition is satisfied. And now we know what mu is. For any x equal to t, I'm going to pick the input with this. I'm going to pick the input. And since I've been talking about omega n or something, let me fix the constants. Let me say you take a deterministic tree of depth n by 100. I can take n by 1000. I can take anything. Omega n, right? I want to prove a bound of omega n. So I can take n by 100, n by 1000, n by 10 million. Let me pick n by 100. Any deterministic tree of depth n by 100, the probability of it computing f correctly when x is picked from mu is less than 2 by 3. Or by the way, this 2 by 3, yeah, I can pick, I should say that it is greater than any constant. If I can prove that this probability is greater than constant, some constant, then I have shown that R epsilon f is greater than n by 100. Sorry. Yeah, that is why I had written less than 2 by 3. So if I show that for any deterministic tree, the probability, the failure probability is greater than epsilon, then R epsilon f is greater than n. This is the statement I want to. Once more, given any deterministic tree of depth at most n by 100, the probability, the failure probability, I have to show that the failure probability is greater than epsilon. Remember that the failure probability is according to this distribution mu. Then I have shown that R epsilon f is greater than n by 100. That means R2 by 3f is also omega n. R1 by 3f is also omega n. R1 by 4f is also omega n, so on and so on. Right?
Yes.
Sounds good. So I have to analyze, to fix a particular deterministic tree and analyze how much, what I can get, how many inputs can I get the correct answer. Okay, under this hard distribution, no deterministic tree of depth n by 100 should work well, should have the failure probability less than a constant. Okay, let me just show you a few things. So you remember what t is, right? T is the place where the function value changes. Now I have a deterministic tree of depth n by 100. Okay. What can happen? Either t will be more than n by 100. In that case, no computational path will give me the correct answer on all the inputs, by the way. Yeah. So when I say a computational path does not give me the correct answer, it will not give me the correct answer on all the inputs. Right? So whatever be your deterministic tree, if it has only seen n by 100 values, that means the remaining values can be 0 or 1, and they can change my function value because t is greater than n by 100. So no leaf can output the correct answer with 100% probability. Do you agree?
Yes.
Could you repeat the argument once?
I'm saying if the computational path has less than n by 100 length and t is greater than n by 100, obviously t is less than n by 2, right? This is what we assume by 1 minus f directly. So if t is more than n by 100, and if I have only seen n by 100 values, there are values by which I can make the Hamming weight to be t or t minus 1. That means this computational path cannot answer correctly on all the inputs of this computation.
Okay.
Correct? But that is not good enough for us, right? If this computational path was succeeding on a constant fraction of inputs, so this computational path will be taken by a subset of inputs. If I answer correctly on constant many fractions of inputs, that's good enough, right? And if that happens for every computational path, I am done. Agreed? So then I have to, then it is not sufficient that on every computational path, I am answering incorrectly at least for one input. What I want is that I should be answering incorrectly for high fraction of the inputs. So first thing is every leaf corresponds to a subset of inputs, correct? These are the inputs on which this leaf will come into action, right? This is fine. Every leaf corresponds to a subset of inputs. Zero, 1 to the n. Inputs on which this leaf will be in action. This is clear?
Yes.
Correct? Right. Now it is not sufficient to show that correspond the inputs of that leaf. If I succeed on constant fractions, I would be even if my failure is just on 1 or 2 inputs on this, then it is okay. Then still my randomized algorithm can succeed. So case 1 would be when t is greater than n by 200. I should say t is greater than n by 50. Okay, when t is greater than n by 50, that means in any computational path, you have only seen at most n by 100 once. Agreed? Right? Because the length is n by 100, you have only seen at most n by 100 once. Now, these n by 100 ones can be extended to inputs of t minus 1 and inputs of Hamming weight. And by simple calculation, you will see that this ratio is a constant. Number of inputs which can be made to t minus 1 and number of inputs which can be made to. And either one of them, I will answer incorrect. That means at every node, I will fail with constant probability. This will deal with case 1.
What was the need of this n by 50 here? Why didn't just t greater than n by 100 work?
Exactly. So this was the point. If I take t to be n by 100 plus 1, then the path where I had seen all ones, right?
So the fraction of inputs on which my answer would be wrong would be less.
Would be very, very small.
Yes.
right? And then I can't say a cumulative property, right? So in even in that case, actually, it will turn out that we can make a comprehensive argument, but the simple argument won't. The simple argument we want to say is that every leaf is answering incorrectly on constant fraction of inputs. That will only work when t is more than n by. Okay. Sounds good. So this was the simple case. If I assume t to be n by 50, then my every leaf computes the answer incorrectly on a constant fraction of inputs. That means in total, I'm computing the answer incorrectly on constant fraction of inputs. This is a calculation which you can do as an exercise. You can easily see that, suppose I have seen n by 100 once. If I have seen n by 100 once, how many extra inputs are there which will have Hamming weight t minus 1? How many of them will be there whose Hamming weight is t? And if you look at these two numbers, their ratio will be constant. With obviously you have to apply that probability fraction rule, right? That Hamming weight t minus 1 will be considered with this probability, Hamming weight t will be considered with this probability. So if you look at
And here we are saying that the failure probability would be a constant, just because we have to prove that it would be more than epsilon. So we can do that by decreasing this this n by 100. We can make it n by some larger number. So
you can make it n by 1000, but even for n by 100, you can see that this will happen. So
no, we won't get the actual constant epsilon, right? So we will have to make.
You want it to be 1 by 3.
No, the actual constant epsilon. No, what is the guarantee that from here the failure probability would?
From here, the failure probability would be something like 1 by 50 or so.
Yeah, something like some constant.
So I can take epsilon to be that epsilon,
right? Yes, absolutely.
Right? Or otherwise, if you want to make epsilon to be 2 by 3, then you take the depth to be n by 1000 or something. So all those you can. Sounds good?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this was the case when Hamming weight was very, very big. There is another case, simple case, where suppose t is less than 100. Correct? In that case, what should be the argument? The argument should be very, very similar to the argument of which function?
OR function.
OR function, right? So argument is going to be very, very similar to OR when t is less than 100. Remember that even if my tree has a depth of less than 100, at some point, I can always increase it to make it a complete binary tree. Right? This will not increase the depth. And if I was cutting off here with value 0 on both nodes, I will put a value of 0. So the decision tree is computing exactly the same function, and its depth has not increased. So I can assume that whatever is my decision tree which answers correctly is actually a complete binary tree of depth n by 100. Is that okay? There's a simple change which you can make to assume uniform. Yeah.
We extend the branch with less depth with the same result.
Yes. Yes. Whatever variable is not queried, put that variable, and irrespective of the answer, continue. And in the end, all the nodes will be assigned. So if you were cutting off here and 3 steps were remaining. Do this, assign variables which are not used till now, and then everywhere answer 1 1 1 1 1 1. If we were answering, right? That will not change how you are computing the function. Sounds good? Are you okay with this argument that I can take it to be n by 100, and then I can take the deterministic tree to be of depth, same depth n by 100. It is a complete binary tree of depth n by 100. Is the definition of complete binary tree confusing? Every path is going to be of the length n by 100. Questions? Okay. Now, if you assume that, then for t less than 100, the argument is very, very simple. Look at the path of all zeros. Okay, that should be a path. Obviously, my input 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 should lead to a path in my complete binary tree. In the end, I will be answering either 0 or 1. You look at the fraction of elements which can be extended to t minus 1 or t, and you will see that they will answer incorrectly on constant fraction of the overall inputs, and that will give you the proof. So this case is exactly like OR. Remember, in the OR case, we also did the same thing. We took the path, computational path of 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then we said that look at the inputs which can be extended to all zeros or Hamming weight 1. And that fraction was high enough. I'm going to do the same thing. Is that okay? Just think of it this way. It is n minus n by 100, choose t minus 1. This I am choosing with probability n choose t minus 1. Correct? If I look at the computational path and suppose I am answering 1, then I am answering incorrectly on each of these inputs. All these inputs will have Hamming weight t minus 1. Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes. And then the probability weight is this much. And if you take t to be less than 100, then this is some constant to the power 100, which is still a constant. It might be a very, very big constant, but it's still a constant. Right? So I'm fine. Now, there is a tricky case. The tricky case is when my t is, between 100 and n by 2. Sorry, n by 50. Okay, right? Because above this, every computational path was computing incorrectly on constant fractions. When t was less than 100, then there was a particular path which had lot of inputs, and many of them were computed incorrectly. So each of these cases were taken care of. This is the only case left. And again, I will only give an argument here, an intuition here. Now I am looking at a complete binary tree of size n by 100, right? what you have noticed is, suppose t is equal to n by 100. If there is a path of all ones, then what should I assign this node?
1.
1, clearly, right? And then in this case, this node answers correctly on all the inputs in this subgroup, right? Whatever inputs lead to here, I'm always answering correct. Agreed? If I have seen less than, how should I say, let's say t minus 1 once, then for most of the remaining inputs, my answer should be 1. So even on those paths, I will be seeing almost all the inputs I will be answering correct. But if there is a path of 0, 0, 0, for that path, I am answering incorrectly on constant fraction.
Sir, for the all one path,
Hmm.
how are we saying that we are answering correctly for all of it? I mean, say supposing we have an input of having weight t plus 1,
Correct.
then
We don't care that has probability weight 0.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You're talking about the hard distribution, right?
Yeah.
So the weight of input is only at Hamming weight t and t minus 1.
Mhm.
Correct. So whenever I say all the inputs, I mean with that respective probabilities, right? According to the hard distribution. So now what you have to show is that the number of inputs. Now, for example, there is just one input here, which corresponds to this particular node, right? Which has all the t being equal to 1. There is no other input which will occur, right? For this direction, which has all ones, this is some particular set of inputs, x1, x2, x3, xn by 100. There is only one input which has non-zero probability and which will go to this path. Correct?
Yes.
Right. So now this is a small trick, but what you will say is that look at all the paths where number of ones are less than, let's say, 7t by 8. Okay, so when the number of ones seen in the path are more than 7t by 8 and t, we will say, let's say you answer correctly on all those. We will ignore all those inputs. The point is, most of the inputs will lie on paths where we have seen less than 70 by 8 inputs and 70 by 8 once. If we have seen less than 70 by 8 once, then on those computational paths, I will have a constant probability of failure. I'm sorry for this detailed argument. Don't worry, I will never ask this in an exam. I just wanted to give you a flavor of how things are proven.
So the thing is that I mean the branch at which we answer correctly, that correspond to smaller number of inputs, which
Small
have a
probability mass of inputs. Yes.
small probability mass inputs.
So the point is, if you look at the computational paths, right? The computational paths in terms of the distribution of zeros and ones, we exactly know, right? It's a complete binary tree. There are 2 to the power n by 100 binary strings which corresponds to these computational path answers, right? 0, 0. So there will be a path of 0, 0, 0, 0. There will be a path of 1 0 0 0. So each leaf corresponds to a binary string of length n by 100. And then we are strictly using the fact that function is symmetric. So even if the label here was x1, x2, x3, here the label was xn, xn minus 1, it doesn't matter. The number of inputs where I will answer wrong or right will only depend on how many zeros and ones I have seen. This is because the function is symmetric. It doesn't matter whether the label was xn or xn minus 1 or things like that. So I have every leaf is represented by what inputs I have seen 2 to the power n by 100. And on most of the leaves where the number of ones are small, like less than 70 by 8, I will be answering correct. I will be answering wrong on constant fraction. Places where I will not be answering wrong on constant fraction of inputs, those are very, very small. Those are like 1 by 100 or something, right? That is going to be very, very small. You can think of, you can figure out how many such paths are there. These paths are n choose n by 100 choose 70 by 8 plus n by 100 yeah, n by 100 choose 70 by 8 minus 1, so on, n by 100 choose t, right? And remember that the 70 by 8 I can make it to be 99 t by 100 or something, and this thing will become smaller and smaller. Okay, again, all these are commutative calculations, but the intuition is this: if your t is much bigger, then every computational path will have constant wrong inputs. If t is less than 100, look at the 0 0 0. For this case, you have to be careful. You have to consider only paths where constant fraction of inputs will give you wrong answer, and then show that those form the bulk of inputs. All these are simple commutative calculations. You can try doing it as an exercise. If you're stuck, I would be.
But we have to prove that for inputs with number of ones between 0 and 70 by 8, it has to be at least constant fraction wrong outputs.
Yes,
of them.
yes, and that is easy. That's exactly the same argument which was used in first case.
Okay, yeah.
So
And-
3 is basically a mixture of 1 and 2.
Okay, in one we consider except the 0 0 0 part, all have correct answers. Let us consider, and the same
Yes.
thing we are doing here also with
Yes.
respect to 70 by 8 and t.
Yes. So we are saying, so instead of 0 0 0 path, we are considering everything up to 70 by 8 paths,
Right.
and we are saying
Yeah.
those constitute the bulk. And in that bulk, I will answer incorrectly with constant fraction. That is because of argument.
Constant fraction of overall.
Constant. So if it is the constant, if even if I show it as constant fraction of that particular leaf, I'm happy, right? Because if it's a constant fraction of a constant, it will be a bigger constant, but some constant. So if it is 1 by 100 of 1 by 100, it is still a constant, right?
Yes, yes.
So I don't have to show that it is constant fraction of the entire total thing. I only have to show that it is constant fraction of the small input size. That's good enough. So that's exactly like argument.
Okay.
But yeah, I understand this is like, this has many things which go into deeper constant calculations, and figuring out these constants are not important. But if you sit down and work for a long time, you can make all these arguments work. I'm not saying that you will understand everything now, but yes, this should sound believable. And if you want to take some time, try it. And if you're stuck, I would be happy to. But this argument will prove that your query complexity R epsilon f is omega for a non-constant C. Now, coming back to what we wanted to say, this is only true for total functions. Because take a simple example, suppose f is partial, where if Hamming weight is more than 2n by 3, then I answer 1. If Hamming weight is less than n by 3, then I answer 0. And it turns out that and it's very easy to see that the randomized query complexity of this function is 4. You just toss a few number of coins. If you see more than half ones, you answer 1. If you see less than half ones, then you answer 0. And that will succeed with hyper. Again, the behavior changes drastically if we reduce from total function to partial function. And in most of the proofs, just for your intuition, when you look at these proofs, in most of the proofs, what you utilize, or for total functions, what is true is that if you pick any two inputs x and y such that fx is not equal to fy, in the Boolean hypercube, there will be a path between x and y. And when you travel this path, you will get to two inputs z and w such that the function value differs here and the Hamming distance is just 1. Correct? If the function value is different at fx and fy, as you take this path, on one of the edge, your function value should differ. This is the same thing which we used in R epsilon f proof. We said there exists a t such that f of t is 1, but f of t minus 1 is, I should say f of x, such that cardinality of x is equal to t, such that cardinality of x is t minus 1. So there was something at Hamming distance 1 where the function value was different. And this need not be true for partial functions. And that's why many of the proofs break down. Again, coming back to the summary, partial functions are necessary. We have to deal with them. They are very, very useful, but we should be careful while dealing with them. Many of the results which hold for total function do not hold true for partial functions. Thank you.
So basically, for